Thank you all for coming to today's event. My name is Chris Apelamian, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Ethnic Studies and the faculty chair of the Center for Research on Social Change. I want to first off thank the MCC for allowing us to use their amazing space. So thank you all for that. Before we begin, though, I have a few housekeeping items. The first is I want to announce a talk for next week, Thursday, April 12th at noon. Catalin Davis, who's an associate professor of sociology at Florida State University, will be giving a talk titled "Hard Work is Not Enough, Gender and Racial Inequality in an Urban Workspace." And that's going to take place in the Warren Room, which is 295 Boat Hall. I also want to ask you all to please remember to either put your phones on silent or turn them off during the presentation today. And thank our co-sponsors, the Department of Ethnic Studies, the Center for Latino Policy Research, and the Division of Equity and Inclusion here on campus. Also, please, if you get a chance, don't forget to please fill out your evaluations for the event. We actually take them very serious, and it helps us shape future events that we want to put on. Right? So if you have ideas, questions, comments, critiques, please share them with us. And I think everyone should have them. Yeah, they're on all the seats. Okay, cool. So now to our speaker. Really quick, I wanted to kind of talk a brief story. So about 2 or 3 years ago, I was really disillusioned with the field of political science, and I still am. It's pretty boring and conservative. So I decided to go to my first sociology conference, and I was amazed at first how diverse it was. I was also amazed at how the amazing presentations, the amount of research on social movements and immigration there. And I went to a really awesome panel on immigration, and one particular scholar really stood out. He was tying ethnographic data with theory, and all while still having this amazing kind of political position there. And I was like, wow, I want to be like this guy when I grow up. He's amazing. So fast forward to 2 or 3 years later, my book just came out. I finally had a little time to kind of relax and invite amazing speakers here on campus. So I was like, hey, I wonder what that guy's up to today. Right, so I Googled him, and I saw, luckily, he has an amazing book, not surprisingly, coming out. And so I emailed him, invited him, and he had a really busy schedule, but he decided to squeeze us into it. So that person is Greg Prieto. He's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of San Diego, which is like the most beautiful campus that I've ever been to. It's like a resort. His research interests lie at the intersection of race, racism, and legal violence, and it's been published in various sociology and interdisciplinary journals. His first book, entitled Immigrants Under Threat, Risk, and Resistance in the Deportation Nation, is forthcoming with NYU Press. And it's a comparative ethnographic study of 2 Mexican immigrant communities in California as they negotiate and mobilize against a deportation regime whose tools include detention and dispossession. Today, Professor Prieto will be speaking on immigrant agency and social movements in the age of devolution. So please join me in welcoming Greg Prieto.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, wonderful. First of all, I have to extend a big thank you to Chris for inviting me here today. I feel very privileged to be on your campus to share this small project with all of you. I've been following Chris, like him, I've been following Chris's research for a long time, so when his name showed up in my inbox, I was very excited. I also want to thank the Center for Research on Social Change, the Department of Ethnic Studies, the Center for Latino Policy Research, and the Division of Equity and Inclusion for their support of this talk. I'm very glad to be here with you this morning. All right, so generally, I'm interested in the way that the Mexican immigrant experience in a nation that simultaneously relies upon and rejects immigrants produces the conditions for and puts constraints upon their social movements. That is, those most affected by a deportation regime that is unprecedented in its scope are also those least available to combat it. So let me offer a brief overview of the book, and then I'll talk about what little piece I'm going to try to bite off for today. So indeed, this book project is about the emergence of a local immigrant rights movement at a time of crisis. I trace this process from the historical conditions that give rise to immigrants' grievances, the informal modes of immigration enforcement that exist on the ground, like the car impoundment that reinforces the racial subordination of immigrants, and a comparative examination of the difference that contrasting local political climates make in the kind of tactics that organizers adopt in those locales. But today's talk explains and extends what I see as one of the central tensions in the book. So in preparation for today, I revisited the data with some new analytical categories in mind, these ideas of oppositional consciousness and its relationship to participation. But today I want to pose the question, how do the everyday strategies of avoidance and insulation in which Mexican immigrants must engage to protect themselves from the twin risks of the dispossession of their property and deportation also encumber their social movements? As one of my primary informants here, Esmeralda, argues, right, only participation in social movement work stands a chance at altering the material conditions of their lives. She would say, while she was organizing all the time, that la participación es la única cosa que nos va a salvar. So today I'd like to talk with you about the role that threat plays in that interactional process of community organizing and what conditions and characteristics lead immigrants to answer the call or not. So Joe Heyman in 2007 asked scholars of migration to consider not just what is done to immigrants, which is typical of the illegality studies literature within the sociology of migration, but also what immigrants do in response. My fieldwork, situated with the social movement organization 2, pointed in the direction of immigrant agency. Immigrants daily manage the twin risks of economic and legal precarity with strategies of avoidance and insulation that I refer to collectively as the shell. But how are those individual strategies related to collective mobilization? The immigrants' rights marches of 2006, for instance, demonstrated unequivocally that immigrant social movements are broad and powerful, and yet their decline has been almost as dramatic as their emergence. This oscillation is not one of action to inaction. Rather, I think it reflects a movement from collective to individual forms of agency. Distinct from questions of individual attributes or political opportunities, I became interested in the way that these everyday practices of avoidance and insulation both anchored and buoyed their social movements. It seemed to me that on the one hand, these default risk management strategies impeded social movement mobilization, an inherently risky enterprise. On the other, the experience of navigating these quotidian risks produced in these migrant folks an acute awareness of, one, the unfairness of their social position, and two, offered a normative basis for their rights claims, their labor. The shell, therefore, both incubates the seeds of and impedes resistance. So allow me to preview the argument, and then I'll move into its component parts. So in response to the intensification of the consequences of illegality in everyday life, undocumented Mexican immigrants have responded by turning inward, relying on avoidance of the unfamiliar and insulation from risk as key strategies for mitigating the risks of dispossession and deportation. This habituated response, keeping one's head down and staying out of trouble, flows into another primary response to the economic precarity that attends immigrant life, and indeed motivates their migration in the first place, to dedicate oneself utterly to work so that they and their family adelantarse or get ahead. Shared by documented and undocumented immigrants alike, work serves as a bulwark against the churn of precarity. Often holding down multiple jobs to support themselves and their families, work is about economic gain, as well as an ethos of respectability and a wellspring of personal value and self-worth. So when organizers or neighbors solicited immigrants to participate in social movement activities, like attending a community forum with the police chief or showing up for a march and a rally, social movement actors are often met with reticence and reluctance. In this way, devotion to work and avoidance of anything perceived as risky serves as both protection from immediate harm and an encumbrance upon the form of resistance most likely to alter their material circumstances. The metaphor of the shell is meant to convey exactly this, the simultaneity of encumbrance and protection. The shell not only insulated immigrants from the risks of deportation and poverty, but also incubated an oppositional consciousness, the quality of mind that transforms structural inequality into subjectively experienced grievance. A fundamental sense of unfairness, that is, the widespread perception among immigrants that they do work that no one else will do, while putting up with the myriad humiliations of daily life in the deportation nation. This standpoint becomes fodder for organizers who work to transform that atomizing sense of unfairness into a motivation for collective action. Surprising to me was the way that they did it. By amplifying risk in the lives of those they sought to organize, by undermining the effectiveness of the shell for warding off legal and economic risk. So by attempting to politicize networks of kin and community, utilizing this and other techniques, organizers and community members together struggled to secure some relief from the local structures of deportation and dispossession that have come to characterize life in the deportation nation. What I'll present next is based upon approximately 3 years of participant observation with one social movement organization that I refer to as La Unión, working in 2 cities that I call North City and South City, in 1 county on California's Central Coast. I made contact with and interviewed in one-on-one and in group settings just over 60 Mexican immigrants, mostly undocumented, but also documented. And with the exception of 6 respondents, these immigrants were adults, primarily between the ages of 30 and 50, in a variety of professions from landscaping to construction to hospice home care. Most were raising children and had lived in the United States for between 10 and 40 years. What follows is my effort to capture their struggles and their power. But before we begin, I think we should ask, out of what historical conjuncture or what set of political economic relations that are characteristic of this historical period does Mexican immigrant agency arise? So for immigrants, the present conjuncture can be captured with the scholarly refrain that immigrant labor is necessary but undesirable. We want immigrants for the labor they perform, but offer very limited pathways to membership, and we beleaguer their presence in this country with campaigns of exclusion. The first part of this contradiction is represented here on the screen. Immigration is responsible in large part for what's often called the browning of America and the growing role of Latino immigrants and their descendants in American politics. So if we move from left to right, if we compare the second bar to the fourth bar, we see that the Latino population in the US would be 10% smaller than it is today without the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, the overturning of the national origin system, and the demographic shift that it initiated. Over time, this is translated into the transformation of cities, neighborhoods, and workplaces, but also politics. Latinos, whose numbers are replenished with waves of migration, have become an important electoral constituency who regularly give the bulk of their vote share to Democrats. We are talking not only about their growing numbers, but also about a latent and growing political power. Simultaneously, Latino immigrants are disproportionately targeted for deportation by the largest deportation regime in history. Many of you will recognize this now familiar statistic. Since 1997, the United States has deported 4 million people, which is twice as many as the sum total of all people deported between 1892 and 1996. So one more time. Since 1997, the United States has deported 4 million people, twice as many as the sum total of all people deported between 1892 and 1996, leading some scholars and activists to refer to the United States as the deportation nation. These removal numbers are driven in significant part by what I think of as a critical transformation in the deportation regime, which is interior enforcement, or local federal collaborations like jail checks or deputizing local police as immigration enforcement, which have transformed the border from a one-time hurdle to an everyday experience. As this graph depicts, since 2003, interior enforcement has come to represent a larger and larger share of deportations, at least up until 2013, the year in which we see the largest number of deportations in U.S. history, over 400,000. Since that time, and in response to Obama-era enforcement priorities and increasingly local resistance to this devolution trend, net negative return migration to Mexico from the U.S., that's driven these figures downward. Many anticipate, of course, that these figures will begin to climb again under a Trump presidency. And if you look at the arrest data, you see some of that. So I think the takeaway here is that growing numbers of immigrants upon whom many industries depend for their cheap and mobile labor are increasingly beleaguered by a deportation regime that is historically unprecedented in its scope. Immigrant grievances have become simultaneously more acute and more important to American politics generally. But deportation is just one risk that undocumented Mexican immigrants face. The other more common risk that I encountered in my fieldwork was the issue of car impoundments. These impoundments had both economic and subjective consequences. So the infamous Prop 187, passed in this state in 1994 with 59% of California voters in support, attempted to bar immigrants from accessing public education and public health care, as well as a variety of other services, as well as required evidence of citizenship or residency for those services, including the issuance of driver's licenses. Though Prop 187 was enjoined from its first days by the courts, most of the law's provisions never took effect. The new requirement, though, that a social security number be provided to obtain a driver's license, survived those legal challenges, producing this conflict in the present. So if we look up on the screen, we have one quote from Hector and one from Santa and Prefecto, right? Hector says, well, in the first place, I lost my job. And I was earning a lot of money because I was the driver of a company, and I had several years in that company. I was established there, and a requirement of my 2 jobs was to have a driver's license. I was really affected by this change in the law because I had to learn other occupations. Santa here says, if our child asks for milk or food and we don't have it and it's 7 p.m., we can't go for it because we're afraid of the police and we don't have a driver's license. We go out at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m., but not later, we're afraid. So immigrants here are left without much choice. On the one hand, they need to drive to work and to shuttle family from home to school, and yet their inability to obtain a license produces fear and uncertainty in their daily lives. Checkpoints set up during commuter hours and the widespread perception that police racially profile drivers that they think are undocumented and unlicensed suggested to immigrant drivers that impoundments targeted them on the basis of their race. Not a formal immigration enforcement practice, car impoundments and the risks associated with driving nevertheless served as a powerful everyday reminder of their racially subordinate status as well as their physical and socioeconomic immobility. These are, of course, just some of the everyday risks that Latino immigrants face. What does the literature suggest that we know about how coordinated opposition emerges from these unlikely challengers? So there are 2 primary ways to explain participation in unconventional politics or protest. The first of these is biographical availability, a notion coined by Doug McAdam in 1986. And the idea here is that if you're free of full-time employment, you're not married, you don't have family responsibilities, and you have the presence of other resources like higher income, education, occupational prestige, those factors lead to participation in unconventional politics like protest. Organizations are the second primary explanatory factor because organizations cultivate political community that disseminates information and eases the uncertainty of protest. They increase efficacy or that feeling that the action you take matters and will make a difference. And 3, organizations help develop civic skills like organizational and communication skills as well as knowledge of the political system. For marginalized people of color in particular who are often locked out of formal political participation, protest has been an important resource, especially for African Americans and Asian Americans, though less is known about Latinos who participate less in unconventional politics because of their lower levels of efficacy and resources, as well as a legal consciousness that's marked by fear and stigma. Though, of course, there is a long tradition here that deserves to be acknowledged, extending as far back as the response to the repatriations of the 1930s through the UFW and the Dreamers movement of the present. But, of course, we also know that even while Latino immigrants might be unlikely challengers, their movements have emerged in spectacularly dramatic fashion as they did in 2006. What spurs this unlikely group of challengers to action? Several things matter. Networks, especially among generations of family, community organizations, unions, and churches. Religion can play an important role, especially when your religious affiliation is not of the biblical literist or pietistic variety. Volunteerism with children's schools or with hometown associations matters, as well as positive group attachment, which leads to a greater sense of personal efficacy. But more recently, scholars have focused on this issue of threat. So while threat was often assumed to dampen protest in earlier generations of social movement scholarship, the studies conducted in non-US settings among conservatives and among undocumented and documented Latino immigrants demonstrate that threat can have a profound and positive influence on mobilization. Ebert and Okamoto, for instance, find that in cities with higher levels of occupational segregation and legislative threats, immigrant mobilization was more likely than in places with open and accessible political systems. Right? Like Blomrad and Voss in their edited volume Rallying for Immigrant Rights, Okamoto and Ebert call for a more nuanced analysis of threat dynamics as they are perceived and acted upon by prospective activists. As David Snow argued in 1998, threats that disrupt the taken-for-granted rhythms of everyday life heighten the likelihood of mobilization. And your own very Chris Zepeda Millan directly intervenes in this tradition and refines our understanding of the motivating role of threat when he asks us to consider not just the scope of the threat, but also source timing and the visibility of those threats. But what I notice here is that threat is often treated as an exogenous factor in the structure of political opportunities. What I'd like to do in this talk is talk about threat as a strategic resource in the interactional process of community organizing. Organizers work to amplify threat in the minds of prospective activists by undermining their primary risk management strategies, the avoidance and isolation that's characteristic of the shell. So I asked, right, what happens when we look not only at individual characteristics and organizational contexts, but also these less visible forms of agency or practices of avoidance and insulation that Mexican immigrants rely upon to insulate themselves from those risks? If collective action is just the very tip of the iceberg of agency that immigrants manifest, then we have before us a question not just of individual dispositions or organizational relationships, but also a question about how the range of agentic behaviors in which immigrants engage is both anchored and buoyed by the avoidance and insulation that's their default response to the deportation regime. What is the relationship, in other words, between the shell and collective action? While migrants encountered a variety of obstacles to greater social movement participation, including a lack of outreach, machista husbands who would discourage their wives' participation, and a range of other factors, I want to focus here on those most directly related to the shell: fear and work responsibilities. And the metaphor of the shell extends the work of Derek Sayre, who, in an excursus on Weber's Iron Cage, argues that the metaphor of the cage is insufficient. Right? If you open the door, you simply walk out of the structure of your unfreedom. Right? The metaphor of the shell, by contrast, suggests a rather more entrenched relationship between power and politics. It's a burden, perhaps, but impossible to live without, at once a protection and an encumbrance. So, to give you a sense of how the shell functions in protection, I want to introduce you to Mirena, who arrived to the U.S. approximately 8 years before our interview. She recounts crossing the border in the trunk of a car with 2 other women, frantically having to call a relative when the men that she planned to meet after crossing weren't there. So instead of going with strangers, she called her cousin, who ultimately arranged safe transport for her. She works today for a residential cleaning service. She says, "Yes, I had just gotten here and they told me immigration was out, and I thought those brown UPS trucks were immigration. I fell over a bicycle because I was trying to run into a store because I thought immigration, and it was only UPS. But I couldn't stand up because I was tangled in the bike, and I was so scared because I thought it was immigration. Everybody stared at me and sort of laughed. I said, 'Why are they laughing?' They knew, but I didn't. I had just gotten here from Mexico." The experience of crossing and subsequent sightings of immigration or local police who impound the vehicles of undocumented, unlicensed drivers almost uniformly cause nervousness or anxiety among undocumented respondents. Mirena's response, to hide, was typical. When other respondents saw ICE agents in their apartment complexes or parked outside in their trucks, they locked themselves in the bathroom with their children. Nearly all undocumented immigrants described refraining from going out, especially at night when the risks of detection were highest, typically because that's when they would set up those driver's license checkpoints. Established from the earliest moments of their crossing and reinforced by local police, insulation and avoidance are the default remedies to the myriad risks that undocumented immigrants face. So then how does the shell also serve as an encumbrance upon their social movement activism? So Roberto and Maritza here and their 2 girls came to what I call South City in January 1996 from Mexico City. They had had 4 cars impounded, the most recent of which after leaving a summer festival. The officer who stopped Roberto assumed that he was driving drunk since, as Roberto says, he has the face of a drunkard, but he isn't one. He has medium brown skin that leaves a rosy glow around his cheeks. So they often notice that there's a patrol car parked outside the 7-Eleven that stands on the end of the single street that connects their main road to the residential street where their apartment is located. They have to drive past this 7-Eleven every day when they come in and out of their neighborhood. When they see the officer, they say they feel nervous and not safe. Before this interview, they had participated somewhat regularly in La Union's organizing activities, including most recently in a community forum with the county sheriff regarding secure communities, or that jail check program that automates immigration status checks for all those booked into local jails. They decided to step away, however. Roberto says, "The changes in immigration made it very difficult to organize a movement." I ask him for an example. He says, "Well, there was that law, SB," and I say, "Oh, SB 1070 in Arizona." He says, "Even here, we can suffer those types of problems. So we thought it was better to stop there and leave things the way they were." So even though they recognize that while no law comparable to SB 1070 has been passed in California, the potential importation of the aggressive and racist enforcement practices of Maricopa County's now infamous and now former Sheriff Joe Arpaio represents a shot across the bow for many immigrants. Coupled with the everyday threat that police represent, it takes little more than suggestion of apprehension to deter political mobilization. Fear here is both diffuse and potent, reinforcing the reflex to keep one's head down and avoid additional conflict. So as I've argued, the shell may encumber collective action, but it also sows the seed of resistance in the oppositional consciousness that it can incubate. And the notion of oppositional consciousness asks us, how do individual grievances get transformed into collective unrest? How do structural inequalities come to be experienced as individual problems? And so the idea of oppositional consciousness finds its origins again in McAdam, but was refined most recently in a 2018 piece by Lisa Martinez and Salazar here, and they lay out three different kinds of oppositional consciousness: latent, emergent, and manifest. Latent oppositional consciousness includes a positive identification with the subordinate or the subordinated group, right, as well as an identification of the injustices that affect that group. Emergent adds on to those two criteria a demand for change to rectify those injustices, while manifest adds on to those three criteria a group interest in rectifying that injustice. So let me give you examples of all three, or at least how I think they showed up in my work with this social movement organization. Here are Miguel and Alejandra. They arrived without papers from Guerrero, Mexico, 11 years prior to our interview. I asked them what had changed in the city since they arrived, and like many respondents, they described that the laws have become harsher than when they first got there. Car impoundments, the frequency of ICE visits, and their perception that the police are increasingly racist were commonly pointed to. They share one story excerpted in part on the screen that they heard in their apartment complex about a man who was carrying a beer, which ultimately led to his deportation. Miguel says the man had a 24-ounce beer in a paper bag, and the sheriff thought it was a beer, and in fact it was. But he wasn't showing it, nor was he drinking it. He was just walking, and the sheriff said he saw a bottle of beer and the guy was sent back to Mexico. I said, wow, just because he had it in his hand? Miguel explains again. The sheriff drove off the freeway when he saw the guy who was walking with the bottle and he thought it might be a beer, which in fact it was. So he stopped him, and it was mere bad luck for that guy. And I think that guy had a record. The sheriff reported him to ICE, and he was sent to his place of origin. And his wife and his 3 kids stayed here. I asked, how did that affect the family? Alejandra weighs in, and she says, the kids are the ones that are going to suffer. The woman is here alone and will have to take care of her kids. Miguel responds, most of the income in the family when we come here is provided by the husbands. The woman might have some part-time job, but she dedicates most of her time to the kids. And that was the case with that guy. He was the one providing more income while the woman only worked now and then. We never have a stable job, and that affects us. It's like we're discriminated against because we're Latinos. I say, how do you feel when you hear stuff like that? Alejandra says, you feel sad because we wouldn't like to be in their place. Miguel says, I feel like sort of impotent for not having the right of freedom of speech as if I were a citizen. Even though you could say something, there would be no one ready to listen to you, to what you have to say. Alejandra says, it's not valued. We can't say anything. We can't express our opinion. Later in the same interview, I asked if they do anything different to protect themselves from ICE or from local police. Miguel says the only thing we can do is we behave the best way that we can. If you're unlucky to have an experience with immigration, we will have to face things because we're not legal. We have to behave well, that's all. That's the only protection because we don't have any other way. So to notice here in this excerpt, right, the recognition of unfairness and the discrimination that they face in the laws that threaten them despite their insistence that they've done nothing wrong. They describe themselves throughout the interview as hard workers. They feel their treatment is unfair because they deserve better or have earned better as a consequence of their labor. Here you see those elements of positive group attachment and the use of labor as a source of legitimacy. And yet they feel as though they can't speak up. Remedies remain individualized. Unfairness is coped with by staying out of trouble and hoping for the best. But still, this fundamental sense of unfairness, of undeserved poor treatment, is fodder for organizers who try to capitalize on this perception in order to convince prospective participants that they do have a voice, the voice of the collective. So for this emergent category, consider the experience of Xiomara, housekeeper and undocumented single mother of 3. She's the kind of person toward whom many people gravitated. She's short in stature with tight curls tied back in a short ponytail, and she exudes this positivity and warmth. She radiates this energy, the fact that she does is made all the more impressive in spite of, or perhaps because of, all that she's endured. And endured she has largely for her 3 sons, one of whom, like her, is undocumented. When I sat with Xiomara in the light-filled kitchen of her small first-floor apartment, she shared openly, pausing thoughtfully before she answered a question. She says that she fled to the United States because of the domestic violence that she faced from her husband in Zacatecas. She encountered a similar situation when she arrived to the United States in 2001. Afraid to call the police because of her status, she ultimately only called them for help after her abuser began threatening her youngest son. Until that point, she'd avoided police and insulated herself and her family from them and other authority figures to ward off these threats of deportation and car impoundments. In this portion of our interview, I asked how she learned about this deportation program called Secure Communities. She says, it's only been recently that I've begun to be more conscious about what really has been happening, of the danger that we're facing, and that we have to do something now. At the very least, reach out for help. Help in some way for us Latinos who all we want. She pauses here. I keep pushing forward by myself with my children. Without any help from this country's government, I don't ask them for anything. I work hard for my kids. I've been a single mother I got divorced 7 years ago. I do my taxes year after year. I keep going and moving forward with my kids. Later in the same interview, I asked if there's anything that she does to protect herself from ICE or from police. She says, even though we're here illegally, I understand we have rights before the police. We have rights. So I don't do anything to protect my kids from the police, no. I do a lot to protect them from the people in the street. That I'm careful about, but in regards to police, no. As with Miguel and Alejandra, Xiomara evidences a growing sense of injustice despite her undocumented status. Her consciousness around these issues, as she describes in other parts of our conversations, is due in part to her work with La Unión and the information she's received during house meetings, one of which she attended and another which she had hosted. She evidences her worthiness by noting that she doesn't rely on the government for support, and the emergent quality of her oppositional consciousness comes from her recognition of her rights before the police. While she continues to take refuge in the habituated risk aversion of the shell, we also see an emergent demand for justice, the claiming of her rights, despite the popular misconception that undocumented immigrants have none. And finally, an example of manifest oppositional consciousness comes from Edgardo, who arrived to the U.S. in 2000 from Guerrero, Mexico. He crossed the border where he was detained, deported, and treated by the Border Patrol, as he says, like an animal. Entering successfully on his second attempt, he came to California where his brother received him. He's lived in South City for 12 years, and in that time he's had no fewer than 4 cars impounded. In this part of our interview, I asked Edgardo why he didn't participate before and why he's begun to participate more regularly now, including hosting one of these house meetings. So throughout our interview, Edgardo had highlighted the way the contributions of Mexican immigrants like him are taken for granted, and the police discriminate against Latinos by impounding their cars and treating them, as he says, like children. He resents, for instance, not being able to take a woman on a date to a bar because he's undocumented, and his matricula consular, that identification that the consulate gives you, is not accepted as valid identification. So he can't even get into the bar to go on a date. He sees his value, and he decries the discrimination that he's endured, and articulates a need for immigrants to speak their truth to power and to act in concert with other immigrants and organizers to get the sheriff, in this case, to take their grievances seriously. Here's an excerpt from that interview. He says, "We need Latinos that are soldiers, that have drive because we have people with courage, who have those feelings because they have wounded our pride, struck our emotions, we've been stepped on badly. So that is what we need, soldiers who will come and say, I support La Unión, I want to share my experiences that I've lived through. And I want the sheriff to know what he and his squad does with us, with our community. So with those of you who have the ability to do this, to listen to us, and who take the time to hear us out, we can reach those people because we can't get there alone. I say we need the entire community. He repeats, the entire community. So we see positive group attachment here, the clear identification of injustice, as well as combined with an articulation of the value of the collective to demand redress in this manifest oppositional consciousness. So my next step here was to link then that oppositional consciousness to participation, right? So these are ethnographic data. They're not readily generalizable, but I still sought a pattern in the data. Right? Do those who exhibit manifest or emergent oppositional consciousness participate more regularly with the work of La Unión? Does belief lead to action? So using the typology I just discussed, I also asked during interviews whether respondents had participated in community organizing with an organization like La Unión. Of the 54 respondents for whom I could make categorical distinctions, I derive these categories from their responses and my observations of them in La Union planning meetings, house meetings, community fora, and so on, basically in the field. And I qualitatively categorize their responses as rarely, occasionally, and consistently. So if, for instance, a respondent attended just one house meeting, where I would often meet folks to solicit an interview, but they didn't indicate that they had participated in the past, nor they had plans to participate in the future, and I didn't observe them at other events like these fora or protests, I categorize that respondent as rarely participating. I categorized if you attended a house meeting and later participation in another event, that got an occasional, right? And consistent attendance at planning meetings, hosting multiple house meetings, or articulating a longer history of activism, I called that consistent. And as you can see in the graph, those coded as exhibiting latent oppositional consciousness make up the bulk of those who participated rarely. Manifest an emergent oppositional consciousness made up the bulk of those who participated occasionally, and those manifest oppositional consciousness made up the bulk of those who participated consistently. So grievances led to a sense of unfairness, but a belief in the efficacy of the collective and their ability to contribute to it were critical cognitive stepping stones to action. But how is this consciousness cultivated among those prospective participants with whom organizers would come into contact? And here is where I think the threat comes in. So this first example comes from one of my primary foremans, Esmeralda. And Esmeralda worked as a family advocate for a local middle school. She would coordinate government and private resources between students and parents from the predominantly Mexican and low-income neighborhood where that school was situated. As a result, she was well known and respected in the community, active with La Union, and when the Great Recession struck and La Union was forced to shutter its South County office and lay off part of its staff, Esmeralda was the natural person to step in to take over a near full-time volunteer role organizing in South City. Recognizing the shell as the preferred mode of coping with risk and vulnerability, she would work actively to undermine the risk management strategies of isolation and avoidance that were favored by immigrants, especially the undocumented. She might say, for instance, it's not enough to drive well and to keep your head down because the police will always find some excuse to stop you and impound your car. She gives the example of the rosary colgada, or hung, right from the rearview mirror. While this basic display of religious devotion may not seem in the least bit risky, Esmeralda would explain that the police can and will use it to stop you since it is technically an infraction of the California Vehicle Code. Right? Anything that could distract or impair the driver's vision is illegal. Good behavior does not put one beyond the reach of police. Esmeralda's intent was not to spread fear for its own sake, but to undermine undocumented immigrants' reliance on individual risk management to spur their participation in collective action. These strategies of the shell will not deliver immigrants from dispossession, detention, and deportation. Only social movements can do that. Over the course of our house meeting campaign, this is a popular organizing strategy utilized by the UFW and lots of other groups. Primary informant Esmeralda and I would ask our core leaders and community partners to invite their neighbors, friends, and family to a home or an organization for a brief presentation from us, followed by a call to action. And from those initial events, we'd solicit the next round of people who would host house meetings, and in that way, we would snowball our base building efforts. Typically, leading up to a larger event, like a community forum with a police official, an electoral campaign, or a protest. During these meetings, we always open by providing some basic information, including about this program, Secure Communities, which has been now resuscitated under the Trump presidency, that screens all those booked into America's jails against this immigration database and seizes those who are identified as out of status. At this point in the meeting, attendees would often ask, right, but what if we work? As one participant did in this particular house meeting with an Alcoholics Anonymous gathering at a Latino community center in late December 2012. And what was interesting to me about the question was it implies something that I heard from undocumented immigrants all of the time, right? They haven't done anything wrong. They're only here to work. Of course, I sees it differently since their presence is criminalized, but the notion that we weren't doing anything wrong indicates, I think, that immigrants have a self-perception of themselves as eminently law-abiding and so innocent, right? And two, labor comes in as the normative basis for their claims to belonging. They aren't bad people because they crossed without authorization. They only did so because they needed to work. So in response to the question, what if we work, Esmeralda responded with her favorite retort, with her delitos or her infractions, and she would tick them off on her fingers. So 1, you're here in this country without papers. 2, you jaywalked. 3, you crossed the border without authorization. And 4, you have an instance of domestic violence in your past. Each of these things she ticks off on her fingers technically designates you as a criminal, even if you work and you've made a good life for yourself in the United States. And those are all reasons that police can arrest you and deport you, including those folks who have a green card. She would also highlight the racial profiling in which police would engage that would lead to their cars being impounded. The experience of participants' own lives became evidence of the limits of a stay-out-of-trouble politics of respectability to mitigate their exposure to police and immigration. Someone follows with the question about what can be done about the Secure Communities program, and Esmeralda would respond in her usual fashion. That depends on the people. We can end the program or not, but that depends on whether or not people in the room right here tonight are willing to show up to do the work to demand an end to the program. The point generally, as it is in most meetings, is that we should not ask what's the likelihood of this local municipality opting out of the program, but ask instead what's the likelihood of you participating in action to demand those changes. The third and final example I want to give you comes from the executive director of La Unión Teresa. And she had a common retort when she was met with immigrants who were fearful of participation. She would say, you already took the biggest risk when you crossed the border. If you can risk that, then you can do this too. The simple fact of their unauthorized migration became evidence that they were not, in fact, as risk-averse as they might think. She would follow up with the question, why did you risk that? Why risk crossing the border? The response was very often, for my family. She responds, that's exactly why you should take on the risks of participating now. And let me also say a word about the broader organizing strategy, this house meeting. Right? By relying on already existing networks of neighbors and kin, organizers weren't seeking to create new relationships, but to redefine existing ones. Akin to what Vicky Ruiz found in 1987 with cannery workers in Southern California, right? The utility of a cannery culture supported organizing. And just like what Vicky Ruiz observed in that study, Esmeralda would do the same. She would piggyback on things like birthday parties, holiday celebrations, support group meetings, and the like when she would make these presentations. And so as social movement scholars have noted, right, part of the utility of organizations is to bring people together in order to share information, create a common culture of stewardship, and ease the uncertainty that attends collective action. The house meeting strategy sought to inspire and transform what community already existed organically among immigrant people by making more political the ties that already bind them. So I think the final question for me then is, who responded to organizers' overtures? And a variety of themes stood out from the data. So in addition to my focus for this talk, oppositional consciousness, what other qualities or experiences were associated with participation as a result of attending one of these house meetings? Those that promoted mobilization on the left, those that worked against mobilization are on the right. And on the left that we can see volunteerism with things like a hometown association with your kid's school, promoted mobilization, English acquisition, close calls with enforcement, past participation including in Mexico with social movements, relationships, personal relationships with the organizer, as I'll bear out an example in just a moment, and also relationships with other participants who are more activated. What worked against mobilization was cynicism, right? The idea that if I participate, it's not going to make any difference anyway, right? Isolation usually is a consequence of sexism, right? And then fear and work, right? The abiding or the obstinate quality of the shell. So let me give you an example of each, one from each column. So coming back to Xiomara, who we encountered in that example of emergent oppositional consciousness. She explains how she came to be more involved with La Unión and ultimately came to host one of these house meetings. I asked her, so, how did you come to host this house meeting? She says, well, the thing is, Esmeralda didn't have to convince me. The thing is, she didn't need to convince me. I heard in one of the meetings all the good things and great information that you have for us that we don't know about. I am sure I'm not the only one. There are other people here in this neighborhood that don't know anything about everything that's happening. And thanks to you guys, I wanted to have the meeting here at my house, and I have the hope of doing another one with even more people. I want to ask people to come because it's something that is very important that everyone needs to be aware of. Esmeralda did not have to convince me. I did it out of the kindness of my heart, and I will do it again. And let me just clarify the question I asked her. I asked her, how did Esmeralda convince you to do this? And this is her response. She countered my presumption that she needed to be convinced. Xiomara asserts she didn't need to. She only needed to be invited. Even though Xiomara did not need convincing to participate in the house meeting campaign, her relationship with South City organizer Esmeralda likely formed an important part of her calculus to participate. When Xiomara first moved to South City, Esmeralda was one of the first people that she met. Esmeralda, who I said works as a family advocate at a local elementary school, helped enroll her son in the school and assisted Xiomara in finding her first job. Over the years, Esmeralda was one of the first people whom Xiomara turned to when the police impounded her car, and then when she survived domestic violence. Her acceptance of this invitation hinged on her relationship with Esmeralda, at least it seemed to me. The trust between them critically motivated Xiomara's willingness to participate. So the invitation wasn't so simple after all. Xiomara needed not only to be asked, but to be asked by the right person. Her subsequent participation grew both out of her commitment to her community and out of her commitment to Esmeralda, to whom she felt connected and perhaps indebted. As community organizing goes, I don't think this point can be overstated. Esmeralda's deep roots in South City and her place of leadership as the go-to person for many immigrant parents who attended the school where she worked had earned her a respect and authority in the broader Latino community. The social movement literature has long pointed to the critical role that organizations play in sustaining protest. I think that organizations work best when their staff and volunteers are organically connected to the communities that they seek to represent. In North City, I attended another house meeting with North City organizer and primary informant Lucero in late August 2012. In one such meeting, we gathered together in Lupe's garage. The garage is situated at the back of a long lot, and it appears she may use the space for entertainment or storage. Round tables are stacked against one wall, and a wet bar sits toward the rear of the garage. Hip-hop music was spilling down from a room above. Lupe had arranged metal folding chairs in a circle around an easel that our organizer Lucero had set up. Lucero explains, we waited for about 10 participants to arrive. He goes on to explain the origins and the missions of La Union and solicits their concerns about the local community, writing them up on that easel. And finally, he attempts to secure their commitment to attend what they call the Junta Grande, a large meeting where they would plan their fall 2012 electoral organizing campaign. Right? So the idea is that these little house meetings will build to this big planning meeting for the electoral campaign. Lucero outlines quantitative goals for the campaign, right? How many precinct captains will we need? How many ayudantes or helpers will we need? How many precinct walkers will we need to win? And as the conversation continues, I note that Lupe, our host, gets up frequently to arrange food on the table or check the coffee and move things around. As she's doing this, Lucero, our organizer, is asking people to fill out these commitment cards. They're these little quarter-sheet papers that ask for your contact information and for you to check boxes next to the different responsibilities you're willing to take up, including attending the Junta Grande. Right? So one woman says that she'll go to the Junta Grande, but she's not going to commit on the card because it's too far in the future. She doesn't want to say she'll do something and then not be able to do it in the end and make someone upset as a result. Without solicitations, others start to offer reasons that other people won't show up. Lucero responds, this time at a slightly higher volume, that we have to quitar los pretextos, right? We have to stop making excuses and convince people to show up. It's our job to make them see how important it is to do this work as a community. Only a few people fill out the commitment cards at the end of the day. Lucero sits next to some of the attendees and fills the cards out for them. Lucero suggests that Lupe host another house meeting, and she responds, but what do I say to people? The other suggests that she ask other neighbors whom she didn't invite today. And one male who is present at the meeting, he's a man in his 50s with dark weathered skin and a cap. He stands to leave and he says that if he's here, he'll come to the meeting. Later, in a different house meeting, we encounter that same man again. And Lucero asks him again if he plans to attend that Junta Grande that's coming up to plan the electoral campaign. The man says again, if I don't have to work, I'll be there. Clearly exasperated now, Lucero retorts briskly, stuttering as he speaks, right? If none of us had to work, we'd all be there. Lucero goes on to say that we will always have other responsibilities, but we must make this work a priority because the safety and betterment of our community depend on it. What I found interesting about this exchange was this waffling from house meeting participants, because in the course of lamenting the barriers to participation for others, they're reluctant to commit to this work themselves. Right? Their initial reactions speak to the obstinacy of the shell. Their initial reactions seek to, even as they recognize the barriers and attitudes that exist about participation in social movement organizing, they find those same barriers hard to surmount themselves. It's coming to the end here. What do I think this all means? This final excerpt from Roberto in that interview that I profiled just a moment ago. with him and his wife. I think it exemplifies the themes that I hope to highlight from this study and provides a springboard toward a theory of immigrant politics that are as liberatory as they are pragmatic. I asked Roberto how life for Mexican immigrants is different than it is for white people. His response is excerpted in part on the screen. He says, "Because they live more comfortably than we do. They have more chances of buying a house. They can get a house while we can't. They are allowed to have a license and we can't. They can obtain loans from a bank and we can't. They have more chances to make money faster than we do. They can travel. They can move to a different place with a passport, a visa, and we can't do that. We can't open a business. There are many of us who would like to have our own businesses, but we can't obtain neither the driver's license nor a work permit because we don't have a social security number. If we, the Latinos, had a social security number, can you imagine what we could do? We would perform miracles if we didn't have to put up with all this. For any job, they request a social security number. That's a very important difference for Latinos. Latinos suffer more. We provide hard work, and we don't fly away and ask ourselves, why us? We are here to do the hard work. The white people work behind their desks, and we have to work in the field. We receive education, but we can't go to college. We don't have a social security number. We stay there, and they continue studying. That's the big difference between a Latino and an American." So I think this talk has been about the way that the defensive practices of Mexican immigrants living under acute threat function simultaneously as protection against the economic and legal risks of everyday life in the deportation nation, and an encumbrance upon the emergence of their social movements. The daily process of negotiating illegality at the same time breeds an oppositional consciousness that immigrant respondents exhibited to varying degrees. Organizers seize on Mexican immigrants' organic sense of unfairness and opposition to their constraints, utilizing a variety of techniques to draw immigrants into the risky work of collective mobilization, including amplifying their perception of threat by undermining the effectiveness of the shell to ward off dispossession, deportation, and economic instability. Immigrant subordination creates the conditions for its redress. I've argued that scholars of migration will benefit from the social movement literature's focus on the structural conditions and interactional processes that generate collective resistance, just as social movement scholars might benefit from the illegality studies' focus on the full range of agency, avoiding, hiding, and lumping it, that are not separate from but intimately linked to the prospect for collective mobilization. I think this study contributes a more nuanced articulation of the role of threat in the mobilization of the marginalized, and I think it offers a correction to an immigration literature that's overemphasized social control, and it extends a scholarly tradition that believes there is no conception of agency outside of the structures of inequality that both enable and constrain it. Roberto's remarks are a poignant indictment of the failings of a distinctly American immigration system that takes what it needs but offers little in return. As scholars like Nyers, Butler, Eisen, Nye, and others have argued, when those impossible subjects who are supposed to be invisible enter politics, we witness in their activism the most naked expression of democratic practice. Immigrant acts represent an invitation to the American body politic to abide by its own norms of equal opportunity and work as worth. From Roberto's perspective, we can cull a critical common sense among Mexican immigrants. He is seeking legal inclusion in order to secure social mobility, and his strategy for pursuing this goal involves an utter devotion to the work that he argues many Americans themselves have forgotten or foregone. His place outside the privileged side of citizenship requires an unwavering fidelity to the conventions of neoliberal citizenship, both to avoid the risks of dispossession, detention, and deportation, and to present himself as worthy of the material benefits that attend legal belonging. Roberto understands best what being an American requires precisely because of his place outside of citizenship. He understands this better than Americans themselves who have grown complacent in their privilege. It's my contention that this perspective, this oppositional consciousness born of the excesses of the deportation nation, is an essential element in the social movements of the marginalized puzzle. For those immigrants who are situated in dense networks of political community that is stewarded by those organizers who are the vital link between organizations and movements, this consciousness helps us explain how movements emerge and how social change edges forward against all the odds. Thanks very much.
I think we have a few minutes for questions, comments.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for being here. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I really appreciated everything, and I hate to ask this more pessimistic question, but I wonder if for the organizers, if any of them were targeted in particular by law enforcement in particular, and if that led to any deportation or being jailed, and what effect this had on the greater community, both on the organizers and people who weren't actively involved.
Yeah. Great question. Let me answer the second parts first. I think there was already kind of a depressive effect on mobilization because of the presence, not just of ICE officers. Those stories were circulated regularly in the community, but really of local police. So folks are already afraid of cops, but they also understand that increasingly being stopped for minor infractions leads to deportation, and secure communities was the link in that chain. The answer to the first part of your question is no, these organizers were not targeted, as we've seen with dreamer activists who are very explicitly targeted. I think that's for one really sort of basic reason, which is that this movement was very local in its nature, right? At times of national mobilization, we would join with other organizations like Chirla in Los Angeles and attend their events, right? But these organizers didn't have the same kind of visibility that I think some of our dreamer activists have. Or other activist groups that take on much more confrontational tactics. So one of the things that I do in a different part of the book, in a different chapter, is I look at the difference local political climate makes to the tactics that people adopt, and the argument there is really straightforward. More progressive political climate, more collaborative tactics, more open lines of communication between city leaders, police, and the community, right? Where you find more repression, you find more confrontational tactics. In this case, it was a march and rally calling for the ouster of the police chief in North City, which they ultimately got. And I think what that suggests is these are not the kind of organizers that are on the radar of ICE, but I'd be interested to know if that's different now, given the way that the reins have kind of been taken off. But here we're talking in 2012, right? Really kind of, it was just before secure communities had gone entirely national. So a lot of the work we were doing is local and therefore a little bit below the radar. Yeah. Hi.
Just to add to that, so
Yeah.
now what is happening, Maru Mora, the young band who started the Not Born Again movement.
In New York, yeah?
No, in Seattle. Seattle, Washington, which she was served with a deportation notice and arrested at her house. And she just went to trial last week.
Yeah.
Targeted because of her organizing.
Yep.
In Seattle, immigration organizers are being targeted by ICE, which is also, I hear, happening in other parts of California.
Yep, absolutely.
So, one question,
Yeah, please. Oh, thank you.
you mentioned gender
Yes.
and sexism, but did
Yes.
you look at heterosexism and how LGBT folks have been part of this?
So I was working, one thing to dovetail on your comment about the repression, I think we should also situate that in a broader reactionary policy that ICE has adopted, right? So the fact that we are seeing a spike in arrests, especially in California, is a direct response, according to Director Holman himself, to California establishing itself as a sanctuary state, right? So I think we have to think about, right, the whole apparatus of repression, but absolutely there is a very kind of vindictive motivation that is underlying the kind of immigration enforcement we're seeing right now. I think it's a really important point to make. The second piece about heterosexism here. So one of the things that we know about the Dreamer movement in particular is that queer undocumented folks often take the lead, right? And that there's something about the coming out experience for queers that lends itself to the kind of organizing that Dreamers do. I think that's really important. And it's something that I hear from my students all of the time. This was much less front and center with this group. So the distinction I would make here is between Dreamers in the 1.5 generation and this generation of adult immigrants who are raising children. I did not encounter a single person who at least outwardly identified as queer. These were mostly folks, married couples, raising kids, fairly religious, and so the presence of queerness as a part of their movement was much more latent than we would see with the 1.5 generation, right? Another way to think about the same thing would be to think about Lacey Abrego's work at UCLA, who talks about she talks about legal consciousness and the difference between the first generation and the 1.5 generations. And one of the factors that she points to as well, adults and their children are socialized in entirely different environments, right? That undocumented adult immigrants are at work where they experience the stigma of their out-of-statusness all of the time. right? Whereas young dreamers who are on college campuses, although that same piece from Martinez and Salazar gives you a lot more variation about how that differs, right, between predominantly white and Hispanic serving institutions, but being on a college campus kind of facilitates, it foments their political consciousness, and that leads to both, right, these sort of very confrontational tactics that latter generations of dreamer activists have adopted, right? But I think it also plays into their own articulation of their sexual identity. So it absolutely matters. I just think it matters to a different part of this movement than it did in this study. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, please.
To what extent is there consciousness among both those from Mexico and children of the whole historical role of the imperialist relations between the United States and Mexico, and of course its related thing of the internal neoliberalism in Mexico, and the other aspects of that.
Right.
In other words, how much they generalize their observations socially, more broadly.
That's a great question. I didn't often see it among my respondents, at least not in those terms. They certainly understood that something about economic transformation in Mexico tied to NAFTA created the conditions that forced them to migrate, right? So instead of hearing like, the regionalization of neoliberalism created the conditions in Mexico for economic migrants, right? You would often hear like, there are no jobs in my town. And there aren't going to be any. And I come from a town where lots of people migrate. So you grow up with the anticipation that if you want to attain the kind of economic mobility that is showcased for you in those messages back in the presents that come back home, right, you're gonna have to migrate too. So you see it in that much like closer to the ground organic sense, but even the organizers themselves didn't often use that kind of language to mobilize people. And I think the reluctance was that kind of radical talk would already be off-putting to a group of people who are, one, tremendously risk-averse, but two, also not super highly educated. And so that might actually be more alienating than bringing them into the fold. But certainly you see that among college activists. So one of the men that I interview here was introduced, he's the father of one of my former students. And she is also undocumented herself. She articulates what you're talking about. She was at Chicano Studies. She was Chicano Studies, Sociology, double major, and this is exactly how she narrates sort of the present conjuncture and where immigrants find themselves today. But I didn't see that kind of language very often among these folks, although certainly the experience of their lives echo the themes you're pointing at. Sure.
I'm a sociology student here at Cal, and I study education, which interestingly, they talk about oppositional culture, right, in education, but it's actually, I think it tends to be seen as like a kind of like a handicap almost, like if you have this oppositional culture, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, you're unable to, you don't believe in your ability to change your future, that sort of thing. Whereas here, it's kind of refreshing to see this idea of oppositional consciousness kind of you use as an idea of like understanding how people mobilize or why people mobilize. My question is actually, I'm wondering how many people did not have the oppositional consciousness, or what the alternative looks like. You have your sample here. I don't know how if you feel like your sample is representative, then you might say that the majority of people share this kind of oppositional consciousness. Right. But I don't know if that's how you did your sampling, but it is often something that comes to my mind.
Absolutely.
Not studying immigration, but
just, how often does this really show up?
Yeah. How many people take that opposite tack as immigrants who maybe from our perspective should be up in arms about the way they're treated, but maybe have a different political consciousness that says, I'm just happy to be here, or this is my country, so I can't really expect much from government or some other kind of perspective.
Right. Great question. And I think one of the things that sort of in preparation for today, one of the things that gripped me about oppositional consciousness as an idea is that I think it really does kind of move us from that deficit to that asset perspective. And I think that's important because you see what kind of difference it can make when you approach a problem from that lens, right? So one set of things. How often does this happen? So of the 61 folks that I interviewed, 54 demonstrated some level of consciousness. And that largely dovetails with what I encountered in the field, so that even if you didn't feel like you could do anything about it, the present crisis generated in a lot of the immigrant folks that I had contact with anyway, a kind of, a really basic sense of unfairness. That's different than when I try to organize different and especially more privileged and stable groups of people, where you have to convince them that something is wrong and then you can move them to, right? You have to convince them that injustice is there and then you can talk about action. That was almost never the case with this group that I was working with. And that's one of the things that struck me the most, was that people were really well situated to talk about like the contours of the constraints that impeded their mobility. Like they were the best at talking about that. And I thought, that's something that keeps coming up that's interesting to me. And it seems like that's something that organizers are playing with, right? Like when you ask folks what your issues are in the community, there isn't silence. Everybody has something to say. And one of the things they said most was local police and car impoundments, right? So they're, right, I don't know how widespread this is, right? But one of the things that I was most struck by in this study was how consistent it was, even though it varied across these different levels. Another word about sampling, one of the things, so like any ethnographic any ethnographic study based on a snowball sample is going to have major limitations in how you can generalize that. One of the things that I thought was useful about the house meeting as a way to build out a sample was we were explicitly trying to recruit people who were not already connected to La Unión, right? So if the concern is that you are already recruiting a bunch of people who are already predisposed to activism and are going to demonstrate some wokeness, right? That, I think, that concern gets mitigated a little bit because the organizing strategy we're using was designed to pull in people who had never had contact with us before. So I think that's kind of how I would deal with that, but absolutely there are going to be limitations here. And you're going to get different responses depending on the community that you're working with. I think one of the clearest cleavages is going to be between immigrant adults and that 1.5 generation we were just talking about.
Thank you, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I heard recently on a talk show, a man who was probably a Trump supporter, and he said that, well, we have more than enough Latino workers here now, and the advances of farm machinery technology, we need less farm workers, a lot of technology is coming, so we're going to replace a lot of those jobs. So that's the reason we should shut our borders.
Yep.
We have enough.
Mm-hmm. Tell that to agricultural growers in California. I mean, tell that to meat processors in the Rust Belt. I think that's an interesting claim, and if it were true, maybe we could engage it, but I just don't think it's true. And every time we go through these cycles of sort of anti-immigrant backlash, this is often what's pointed to, is right, we just don't have a need for this, right? You're creating an artificial competition effect between immigrant workers and the native born. And I think that's largely untrue. And one of the other ways that we can demonstrate that it's untrue is that we can look at the economic literature that approaches the question about labor markets. And what we find, I mean, it's a little bit mixed, right? But what we find again and again is that where we see big increases of immigrant folks, we don't see very much of a wage effect or a displacement effect at all. Right? And this is largely due to the fact that like the native born and immigrants traffic in different kinds of labor markets, right? The segmented labor market. And that in recruiting immigrants to those jobs, you're kind of building a pipeline that both keeps immigrants in those positions, but also excludes other Americans for whom like they would never consider field work as a potential job opportunity. So I would start with an empirical question about whether, one, we actually don't have need for labor. I think that would be a hard sell for a lot of growers. Right? And then I think, two, is when we recruit immigrant labor to this country, does it have that competition effect in the first place? And I think if you wanted to try to engage those questions more deeply, I've really looked to the work of David Card and Giovanni Perry, both I think are UC folks, who've asked that question about what impact do immigrants have on labor markets.
Last question. Only because she's the boss.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg, for your talk. Could you talk a little bit about your role as an activist and as a researcher and how those were distinct, if they were or not? And you said we when you were talking about the organizing, which I think is great, but I'd just like you to hear you talk about that.
I think I trepidatiously use the word we. So there were really kind of two primary sites where I was gathering this data. One was from the interviews, but then it was also like working with this organization and doing the organizing itself. So when I'm talking about Esmeralda, ticking off the delitos on her finger, right? I was sitting next to her doing what I could in my crappy Spanish to like explain what's going on with secure communities, why folks should be involved, right? Like I was there for that. It's interesting, though, that you asked this question because a friend of mine and a colleague asked, he's like, why don't you frame this as participatory action research? And it just never occurred to me. Like, that's what it was. It was like, I was doing even before I came to this project, I was doing work with this organization just as part of my activism, as part of my service life. I just thought it was important. And so when it came time to try to imagine what the dissertation was going to look like, I thought, why not do this with this group that I already have these relationships with? And it brings together a couple of questions, broad academic questions that I care about, right? How do people negotiate legal violence? How do race and racism manifest themselves in the presumably race-neutral practices of local enforcement, right? I saw all of that in that site. And so I think for me, the relationship between activism and knowledge production kind of happened together, but I haven't led with it. And I'm now beginning to ask myself, like, why? And I think a big part of that answer is my dissertation committee, to be perfectly frank. That the way you convey your intellectual chops is not to start with, I have all of these political concerns that are predisposing my work to a particular kind of argument. And so I just kind of let it go, even though I think it's at the foundation of all of this. So I think maybe if there are students in the room or scholars who are struggling with the same thing, I think especially now coming up on tenure, thinking about, okay, how can I define my own scholarly identity? And I think I feel now much more prepared to identify as like a scholar activist than I did then. But it was because I was afraid that people wouldn't take me seriously.
Join me in thanking him again.
Thank you so much.